Welcome back to Hot Mess Espresso, guys. We have an author, a military vet, and a father. We have Juan Espinoza on the pod today. How are you?
Pretty good yourself. How you doing?
Pretty good. Pretty good. We are surviving. So I guess let's just dive into it. You were in the military for a while, did a few deployments and stuff like that. Um, what made you go from that to writing a book?
Pain. I think the big thing was a lot of the times we hold the pain we have. We
Hmm.
bury it. We tend to think that if we bury it enough, it doesn't exist. But that's not how pain works. It has to be felt. So for me, I buried it for so many years, and eventually, I hit my breaking point where I just thought that if I can have this pain teach me something, it's worth having. So that's basically what happened. That's how I wrote my book.
Yeah, and obviously I've read it. It's phenomenal, and it's a very it's a quick read, but it's also a very like insightful read. And for those of you that haven't read the book, it's phenomenal, but also like there's a lot of reflection questions. So it's a quick read, but also like you have to pause and like think about things. But what was the, I guess, inspiration behind like putting those self-reflection questions in?
So the how I wrote my book. So more of a context. So wrote my book in 2 days. So
Oh,
I was
well.
at yeah, it was fairly a few months ago. So I was at a point where I was just in a lot of pain,
Mhm.
mental pain, and as a what we tend to do is try to relieve that pain or numb that pain.
Mhm.
So I went outside. I was working out, and during this night, it was very like it was storming. I have a metal awning in my backyard, so it had that like tink tink noise, that noise where rain hits the metal.
Mhm.
So it hit that, and I just felt something that's told me to walk out. So I walked out in the rain and just fell to my knees. At the point where I felt that life was just kicking me on the ground. I was just there, just couldn't get up. But at that moment, I felt like a fire I never felt before. And basically, I felt that after everything I've been through, everything I've lost, you can't beat me. So I got up and lightning and distance struck, went inside, dried off. I wrote my book for 2 days with a bottle of whiskey and crying my eyes out. But I think that it's with the reflection or the reflective pauses. I didn't want my story to be my story. I wanted it to be our story
Mhm.
because we all go through some type of pain. And I think that that's the reason why I wrote my book so
Mhm.
fast because we all go through some type of pain. So if I can embrace my vulnerabilities, I feel like you can embrace yours. I think that's an important part is being vulnerable. And I think that's a strength, not a weakness.
No, it absolutely is, and that's a lot. It's always heavy coming from somebody saying that it's like okay to be vulnerable, but especially with your, I guess, career of being military. And the biggest thing in the military is you don't talk about that stuff because you're either going to get like rear deed or blacklisted or whatever. So, how was it like kind of overcoming that mental block of, keep it down, keep it down, keep it down, and then just going from that to we're just going to lay it out all out there?
Well, I think that's the big thing is really when you come, with the military aspect, right? Like you
Hmm.
said, you bury it. It's just like you don't want to be weak because you don't want to be blacklisted. But at the same time, it's we all feel it, right? We all going through it and we're not willing to share it. But if we share it, how much more powerful can we be? A big thing is what I see is people always say pain to power. But what is power without purpose?
Exactly.
I think that's a big thing is we have to show our vulnerabilities and show that we're not okay, but we're still pushing through it. So that's my big thing for everybody that's going through some type of pain, or especially the military. Like I've had 5 years deployed. 4 in Afghanistan. I've been through a lot. Uh,
Yeah.
if I can show it, you can too as well. And I think that's the impact I've shown with not only myself, my family, but also the people I've deployed with. It's like they're opening up and showing like, yeah, like I'm not okay,
Mhm.
but it's okay to not be okay. If that makes
Exactly.
sense.
No, exactly that. Did you get a lot of pushback when you started like talking about the things you experienced while deployed and, just your mental health surrounding that? Were there some people that were like at first like we don't talk about Bruno kind of thing or was everyone like, yeah, like thanks for doing that?
A 50-50, I guess you would say. Some
Mhm.
people said like, you know, don't talk about it, just go through it. Then I had a lot of people that said like, thank you for talking about it because I'm going through it.
Mhm.
I think that's the biggest thing, for me is the impact I can have on our generation or the future generations or even the previous generations. Talk about things that need to be talked about. And I think that's a big thing. It's for me, it's let's break that cycle. If I have to be the scapegoat or the black sheep to break that cycle, I'm 100% fine with that.
Yep. No, I have zero military experience. I married somebody in the military for a short period of time, that but to relate to it, I grew up in a house where you kept that shit in house. So having a podcast where I'm yapping about my mental health and about like the different things like that definitely they were like, okay, like what exactly are you going to talk about? And I'm like, listen and you'll find out. But but there was something that you had said in your book that I've heard commonly through like my friends that have served and stuff like that you almost want to go back to being deployed because when you're home after a deployment, you don't feel like you belong. Um, can you kind of do like a little bit of a dive into that psychology end of things? Because I don't think a lot of people really understand that mentality.
So when you think about it, right, if you're in an environment that you're accustomed to, you know what happens, you tend to gravitate towards that environment. So when you leave that environment, it's unfamiliar. It's different. You don't know what's going on,
Right.
right? Your mind's racing at this point. I think that's a big thing when you use that with trauma.
Mhm.
That's a it's a big getting familiar with your environment, right? So I tend to tell people the military type of trauma is the same thing with the relationship type of trauma you've been accustomed to,
Mhm.
right? So think of a toxic relationship you've been to, or just anybody's been through.
Mhm.
It's always the same thing, right? Like toxic, toxic, toxic. And then someone that's not toxic, you're just like, you start to question every single thing about this
Yep.
person, right? So when you question that, now it's like, it's not familiar. Like, what is going on here?
Right.
That's the same thing with military type of trauma or military type of environment. It's like, I know what this is. For me, Afghanistan, I know what that is. To me, that's like a home away from home. I
Mhm.
know everything about that. But when I come to back, stateside or someone comes from a toxic to or a healthy relationship, they start to question things like,
Mhm.
why is it quiet?
Yeah.
It's not. I'm not used to quiet, right?
Right.
So that's the big thing for me is that's how I see it, and that's how I gravitate people that are not military to see the same perspective. Is if you throw it in those type of terms, it makes sense.
No, it absolutely does. I've always said that there's safety in chaos because you know the chaos. Like when I got out of a relationship a few months ago and it was literally the healthiest relationship I've ever been in to the point where I was literally like, I can tell you what's bugging me and you want to fix it instead of like argue with me about how it's not a problem? Like what? Huh? Like it was the strangest 6 months of my life. The best 6 months of my life, but it was the strangest. But did you also find it kind of difficult to reintegrate yourself into like the house that had created a routine and a dynamic for, 9 months to a year without you in it.
That's the biggest part is when you go to a life that moved on without you. They've done things that you weren't there. And that's the biggest part is learning to try to reintegrate yourself to that part of that life, that normalcy. How do you do that when you feel like they live without you?
Yeah.
That's the biggest part is when you learn that, life moves on, but you have to somehow fit your way back in. It's not the same way that when you left. It's not remotely
No.
close.
No, it definitely.
So
Yeah,
yeah, so for me, it's just trying to fit back into that mold, to fit back into that part of my life that I had. But in reality, it's not the same way you had before. It's moved on. You have to adjust to that and move on with that.
was that kind of hard to wrap your brain around a little bit? Like, obviously, it makes sense now looking back, but at the time, was it just kind of like, what the hell?
Oh, easily, easily, hands down. I think that's the biggest part. It's like, I'm the head person of this family. I'm the breadwinner. I'm just, the head of the family. But to to think about the fact that I'm not,
Right,
I wasn't for the last several years, and that was a big part of me to adjust to that perspective. But also, is very humbling at the same time.
for sure, for sure. Um, what were some of we're just gonna like bebop around, but like when it comes to your book, what were some of your like your favorite self-reflective questions that like stood out to you?
A lot of the self-reflective questions that stood out to me is more based on forgiveness and childhood,
Mm,
right? So a lot of people tend to think that their past represents who they are. Not necessarily the case. It's more of a reminder, not necessarily who you are. You know, the the past doesn't define you, but who you are and what you do defines you. I think that's a big important impact that people don't see. Everybody gets tend to their or gets tethered to their past and think that, like, well, my family did this or I did this, that's who I am. No, it's not. It's a reminder. It's not who you are.
no,
So
1000%.
those questions have the biggest impact on me. But I think forgiveness was a big impact on me on just the forgiveness questions because everybody tends to think that forgiveness is a weakness. They think that if I forgive the person that did me wrong, it's okay. It's not saying it's okay. I'm just saying it doesn't hold any power over me. That's the biggest impact that I've seen. And those are the questions that impact me the most. And also acceptance too. That's a big part of my journey as well as the questions I ask. It's about acceptance. Like I've done things that I'm not proud of
Mhm.
and I've done things that, are not the best, but I've accept the fact that I've done them in a state of mind that I'm not fully developed or fully capable or have full understanding of.
Right.
So when I accept the fact that I wasn't okay in that mindset, but I know better now, that makes an impact.
No, absolutely. Was it kind of a difficult process to start seeking help on things, or was it just kind of like once you decided that you needed help, it was just like, go?
Oh, difficult. So no one wants to expect, especially with my background or
Mhm.
just anybody that's very independent uh person, they're just like, I don't need anybody's help. I can do it on my own. But reality is we can't. That's a humbling part is we're not perfect. We have, our perfections and our imperfections. But the fact is, we have to address the fact that we're not perfect and seek the help to be a better version of ourselves. That's the hard truth, but it's the honest truth.
It's definitely a hard pill to swallow that you can't like. 'Cause I got into it with someone sometime like on a live stream. that they were giving me every excuse in the book as to why they didn't like want to go to therapy. And I'm like, because they thought that therapy was taking the easy way out. And I'm like, no, therapy is like the 80-20 rule. Like the therapy is the 20% of helping you figure your shit out. And then the other 80% is up to you. It's not taking the easy way out. And I've just, that mentality blew my flipping mind because I was like, what are you talking about?
So I think with therapy, right? So I did a therapy session. I did
Mm-hmm.
it for one session. I didn't like I didn't like it at all
Mm-hmm.
because the reality is because I went to a therapist. They're just like, tell me your pain. It's like
Okay.
I don't know anything about you, lady. Like, why am I gonna open up to somebody I have no idea about? Like
Right.
no one in their right mind is gonna be like, yeah, here's everything that's wrong with me. No. So for me, I stopped that. And so I wrote my book. It's if I'm able to show my imperfections, let's talk about yours. And I think that's the therapy. It's it's a different perspective. They're seeing things from they don't know you, they
Mm-hmm.
don't know your situation, they don't know what you've been through, but they're seeing what you're telling them. That takes a lot. It's very humbling
Yeah.
because you're not going to want to hear what you want to hear.
Not
You're
at
going to
all.
hear the honest truth from their perspective.
Yep. No, my therapist has usually just kind of like lets me vent and then, whatever. But sometimes they'll look at me and be like, you're better than this. What are you doing? And it's like, oh shit, I am. And it's very humbling to be like, oh, I'm spiraling or something like that. So it's definitely helpful, but you also 9 times out of 10 have to look within yourself and see those patterns because you don't have your therapist following you around like a guide dog. So, you
Exactly.
are responsible for that.
I think that's a big part. It's a humbling experience, but people don't want to see that because they're gonna be like, well, I done everything right. But when someone tells you like, you could have been better or
Mhm.
you weren't the great,
No.
that's where it's like, people tend to take a step back.
No. And I think the biggest thing about growth in general is when you can look back and realize that 5 years ago or even a year ago, you would have handled a situation completely differently than you did. And you're like, oh, that's how this works.
Exactly. It's just, for me, it's very enlightening, I guess you would say. It's the fact that you see things from everybody's perspective, not
Mhm.
just yourself, but, maybe the person you're with, but also the person that is not in this situation, but they're still looking at it as like
Mhm.
a family member, your dad, your sister, your brother, your daughter, whatever the case is. You're seeing that from their perspective as well. And I think that's a big thing. We're not all perfect, but it's okay.
Definitely. How did um how did starting to kind of take control of your mental health and really like admitting that you're not okay and being vulnerable and being in those like shitty spots to kind of like power through it versus like, substancing or whatever through it or just stuffing it down. How has that shaped you as a father?
I think the big part is learning that it's okay to not be okay.
Mhm.
So for my daughter, like she hasn't read my book, she's seen my book, she's, seen some, merch, some t-shirts I've designed, and
Mhm.
she's very open to that. But she's also seen me grow. She's seen me, from before where, you know, dad was always just very just quiet, very reserved, didn't say much to know, when dad talks a lot more, he expresses his feelings or he gives me a different perspective on what I'm going through, you know, as a kid in school, I tend to tell her like I've been in your shoes in some perspective.
Mhm.
It's okay to be hurt. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be sad. I think that's a big thing. It's as a parent, you have to learn that it's it's a right and a wrong way to do things. I get it. There's a time to be tough and tough things out and suck it up, but also a time to be okay, to cry and to be hurt because that's just part of who we are. And
Mhm.
I think for me, I've grown to, especially being a girl dad, right?
Yeah.
I have to deal with a lot of emotions. From a military perspective, I was like, yeah, just suck it up, just move on. But you
Mhm.
can't do that. So I've grown, in my emotional way by learning that.
It's almost like reparenting yourself while parenting your kids,
Exactly, 100%.
which is
Definitely.
mind-boggling. Like, I don't have kids, but, like, I, have nephews and stuff like that, that I'm just like, you kinda look back and you're like, "Oh, this is not how, like, my parents would have handled this," and it's like, you're doing better. You're still probably gonna give them a reason or 2 to go to therapy when they're older, but, there's less reasons and it's less of a core memory kinda thing. But it's
Hey,
difficult to, like, reparent yourself and, like, work on your own reactions to things while
ex
teaching them that it's okay to XYZ. It's fucking bizarre.
exactly. I think that it's not necessarily you don't have to be a parent, but if you've been around kids, niece and nephews, right? You've been around some type of kids.
Mhm.
How can we be a better parental figure or adult figure for them that we had?
Yep.
That's the biggest thing.
And I think it's also really nice when, like, your parents are reparenting themselves and realizing, like, the mistakes that they made, so they're also, like, having those hard conversations with you. I've been lucky enough to have those hard conversations with, like, my dad and stuff, but, seeing him handle my nephew in a completely different way is a little bit of like, "That's not how it would have happened when we were kids," kinda thing. And it's just like, "Oh, so you are capable of that," but it's also nice to see the growth, honestly.
Exactly. I think the big thing is a lot of people get stuck in their own ways, right? It's
Mhm.
like, well, I grew up this way. This is how I do it, and this is how I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
That's not growth. It's seeing everything from different perspectives. For me, it's you know seeing my daughter. It's just like, yeah, I can go. When she was younger, I could go with like just very suck it up, take it as you get it type thing, or learn and accept that you're flawed in some type of way. And when I talk to her, I explain it to her like, yeah, I was wrong. I thought this because of this, and now I think this because of this. And so for her, she's growing that understanding where it's not just me growing, but also my dad is growing too because he's telling me things or teaching me things that he didn't know, but now he knows.
Right. And I feel like as a parent, you're also setting the example for like dating down the road. And
Oh, wait,
there's a lot of pressure to that, I feel. Like you're just like, "Oh god, like I'm modeling like who she should look for like in a partner and it's either going to wind up with a whole lot of bullshit or she's going to have a hell of a lot of standards, which she should." And like I'm sure that's daunting at times.
oh, easily. So think about it: high standards or low standards. Pick one.
Right. It's like, "Oh god."
Yeah, high standards all day.
Mhm.
But I think it's easier to prove than to tell,
Yep.
right? It shows more initiative. It shows more power when you prove it. Like, yeah, I'm not the best. This is how you should be. Versus like, yeah, you can read a book and for an author that's hasn't been through anything. It's like, yeah, do all these things and you be the best person in the world, but
Don't get
you never lived through that. Like, how can you tell me?
don't get me started on self-help books. Self-help books are for people that have had like 0 trauma basically. And this is not all self-help books. I have found several that work really well, but they're not exactly structured around people that have been through some shit. So they're very suck it up buttercup, make the habits, just do the thing. And it doesn't, and like, not that I want to be coddled when it comes to my mental health, but it's very difficult sometimes to be like, okay, like you had a very successful whatever, and now you wrote a book on it, and you expect me to do this, even though like my brain is still rewiring. Like it's hard to take it seriously when they haven't like been through some shit.
Exactly. I 100% agree. So that's where like my book is like a memoir slash self help because I've been through the shit. I'm telling you exactly like what I've been through, so that's where like that blend is
Mhm.
because, a big thing for me is a lot of the self help books I've read throughout the years. It's like, you know, think good thoughts,
Yeah.
today is a good day,
Just be
right?
positive.
Just, yeah, like drives me nuts.
Oh my
Like,
god.
it's not, it sucks.
No, it's absolutely
so,
terrible.
so for me, it's just being authentic. So that's where my book comes in. It's like, hey, like, yeah, he's not great, but here's some shit he's learned and he's been through the trauma. And that's where I wanted to help people to see that, like, I'm not your Tony Robbins, but hey,
Right.
I'm just me. I think that's a big thing is for people being real and authentic that don't show me the good, also show me the bad. Like,
Yeah.
let me see the tough stuff you've been through.
Right. Like, I want to know what made you spiral at 25. Like, you know, that I'm going to take more
Exactly.
seriously than just like, I've been through some things, but this is like, I feel like a lot of self help just talks at you versus like your book. I know it's not technically a self help, but it makes you pause and think about things versus you're just like reading along and getting spoken at versus like having to pause and be like, who was a really influential person in my childhood? Like, why do I like, pop off about XYZ? It really makes you think versus just being spoken at and like told what to do.
I think that's a big thing is I wanted the readers to also reflect on their story as well as mine, but I also want them to see that just imagine me next to you because I've been there.
Hmm.
I'm there with you. Like I'm not someone that came from a wealthy family. I've literally been in your shoes and I'm along that journey with you. So if I can reflect, you can reflect. So I think that's a
Exactly.
big thing of why I wrote my book. Because a lot of the self help books I've read, it's just like, yeah, these people like, just happy thoughts and your day is good.
Your
You're
gratitude journal.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're a multimillionaire. What are you talking about?
Yeah. And I'm not saying that multimillionaires don't have like personal problems and mental health, but like they just don't talk about it.
Exactly. I think that's the thing is we have to talk about it. So for me, just to ask those questions to get people to think, like, yeah, I could have just wrote my book without those questions entirely and like, yeah, here's my story, like and subscribe, right? But
Right.
to me, it's just like I didn't want that.
No, I literally remember like reading it. And I kind of had to like finish it really quick because I looked at my schedule and I was like, oh shit, I have the prep call with him tomorrow. But like, when I had first like I was read through the first couple of pages and then I get to the first like self-reflection questions and I was like, oh shit, this is gonna be good. Like I almost like didn't give a flying shit about any other word on the page, but I was like, this is like we need to do more reflection questions when we're, it just I guess that made me as a person feel more like connected to your story and could like relate to it more versus it being just like let's read like 200 pages of a trauma dump kind of thing.
Mm. I think that it's a big thing. It's not me now. It's you,
Mhm.
right? It's not just like, okay, well, here's my story. Now it's like, okay, like I'm reading halfway, through my story, and I'm like asking you a question. Now you're like, hold on, like, damn, I was supposed to pay attention? Like, what?
Right.
you
Yeah,
know,
you
s-
almost have to like go back. You're like, "Oh, my ADHD skimmed through this at a Spencer Reed level, so let's read like what were the last two paragraphs?"
exactly. I think it's a big thing is like when, a teacher asks you, a question in class, you're just like, I was totally not paying attention to what you just said the last 20 minutes. But now you ask me a question, I'm like, oh, damn, now I have to pay attention. I think that's a big thing with my book. It's the exact same thing. I'm throwing these things at you left and right. It might be 2 pages in, it might be 10 pages in. You don't know.
Yeah. But like that's also but I've always been the type of person that really enjoyed like those books that you would read and then there was like that like chunk of like 10 to 20 pages after and you'd like go through and it was either like an intro into their next novel or it was like book club discussion questions and I would just love that because I was like I would go through and I'd be like oh I missed that spot let me go back and like so it would really help me like immerse into the book but
I think that's a, I,
that
I think
kiddo.
that's a, yeah, I think that's a big thing. It's the biggest response I've got was those questions.
Hmm.
Everybody loves those questions. And I think that's a big part is, yeah, I have my story. Cool.
Hmm.
But let me hear yours. And I think that's a big thing with my questions is people love that because now they're part of the story. It's not just about me. Now it's about you and us.
Yeah, was that like your big kind of validating moment where you were like, "Oh, I'm actually doing something here." It like more than just writing a book. You're like, "Oh, I'm actually like making even like an iota of difference."
Exactly. I think the big thing for me is the reviews, right? When people let me know or they'll, send me an email or let me know like your book helped me a lot or the questions helped me a lot. That's when be like, it was more like a shock and awe. It's like, oh, I am, you know, helping.
We're doing the thing.
Yeah, like, we're doing it somehow, but we're doing it, and I think that's a big important thing for me is to know that I'm helping people, just the impact I'm trying to make. That's what makes me continue to do what I do.
Is there like a little bit of pressure sometimes where you're like, I'm making a difference, and it's like, oh, I'm making a difference? Like, is there kind of like a sense of like scary responsibility sometimes because you're like, oh, I'm actually like doing something with this. Like people are gonna look up to me. Like I can't fuck this up kind of thing.
Yes.
I was like, there's no way you're shaking your head right now.
Yes. So, especially with my family, they see I like work all the time. It's either like, a lot of with my business, the book, helping people. So my typical schedule is I work like 16, 20 hours a day. And I'll do that for about 3 days and then I'll crash for about a day. Then I'll continue, keep going. Then, they're
Hmm.
like, you got to pace yourself. But for me, the pressure is I'm helping people with their life. And if I don't continue to do what I do, that's one less person I can help.
Yeah. It's
So
definitely
that's
trying to find that like ebb and flow though of just being able to put those like personal boundaries up and stuff. I've been doing this almost 2 years and I'm still figuring it out.
yeah, so I think that's the big thing for me. It's like I'm just trying to help everybody and anybody. So when I don't feel like I'm performing at that level,
Hmm.
that's when the pressure starts to hit. It's like, oh, damn, like I could help two or three more people if I would just work 2 or 3 more hours.
Right.
But also knowing the fact that I have my own commitments, my own life I have to address at the same time. And especially being a father, being being part of a family, I have to put that, up front as well. So that's the hard part is to bridge the gap.
Um, I think the one of the big things that also jumped out to me, and I think I said this in our prep call, was you fully admitting your faults on like what contributed to the end of your marriage. And as someone who has been very recently divorced, that one was like, well, shit, it can happen. you know? Um, has your ex-wife read the book? And also, if she has, what was her take on seeing all of that in black and white?
So she hasn't read the book as as of now.
Hmm.
Um, she's fairly aware of the book, as I've heard. Like I said, I think that's a big thing. It's for me. It's when you're in a relationship, you tend to think you did everything right.
Hmm.
I did everything I could that you thought. Like that's a big thing for I tend to tell people, what's the good you did, what's the bad you did, but also the big part is what you didn't do. All right. And I think that's a part of it's more humbling as well as more self-reflective to know the fact that, for my marriage, for instance, like I did everything physical wise. Like, yeah, I was there, paid the bills, did everything you need to, but also the emotional part, I wasn't there.
Right.
I think that's a humbling part for me. It's just like, damn, I thought I was doing great, but you could have been better.
Yeah.
you know, I think that's a big thing for me to learn that. I think if everybody self reflects on their relationships entirely and they change their perspective, they could
Hmm.
totally get a different view on how to approach relationships in a different light with a more compassion and more empathy, but also as more as leadership and determination at the same time.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I mean, my ex-husband and I kind of dealt with the same things of like just the emotional availability was just not there. But at the same time, on the flip side, I knew deep down he was not gonna check off the boxes that I needed. And I still tried my hardest to mold him into the person I needed him to be. And it was not gonna happen. I knew that, he knew that, and it crumbled. And thankfully we're, still incredibly, good friends. We're very civil, blah, blah, blah. He's still invited to Christmas with my family. But like, it was we kind of had it out last weekend. And when I say had it out, we just actually had a discussion on it. And he was like, I just can't be the person that you needed me to be. And I was like, I know. And I knew that. And I am sorry that I still tried to push that knowing what I did. And because of that, the resentment built up and I turned into a straight see you next Tuesday. Like it was bad. It was real bad. And being able to admit that and just kind of like clear that air was like so freeing, at least for me. I don't know if it was freeing for him at all. But, you know,
So my question would be, why would you try to fit him to the mold you want him to be? What was that mold you're looking for?
just somebody that, you know, met my emotional needs, that I didn't feel like I was talking to a wall 9 times out of 10. And it was very difficult. And I just wanted my marriage to work. At the end of the day, I just wanted my marriage to work. I didn't care how dysfunctional it was. I just wanted it to work. And the wheels fell off, and they fell off. And looking back, I'm like, I should have, you know, understood what I needed to understand. And like, I know it now. We've been split up for over a year, but it was just like, you have to take that time away from each other to kind of like actually have a more, I guess, unbiased look at it and understand like your faults in it. Because I definitely contributed a lot to the downfall of that because of my resentment and because of my just like, I need you to be this person. I know you can't, but I'm still going to try.
So I think that, so you said you want your marriage to work just because you want it to work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that more of just which been ingrained in you just for the typical, like maybe the past, or just like, what is a marriage work? What does that mean?
Yeah, you know, I still don't know, obviously, because I'm divorced, but it was just because, you know, even when you get divorced for the right reasons, there's still like kind of a stigma of shame of like, oh, you couldn't make, you know, a marriage work, even though like if you are in a long-term relationship for like 10 years and you break up, nobody looks at you like that. But because there's a piece of paper attached to it, all of a sudden, like, oh, you just like suck at relationships. And it's like, no, because like I think there's like 2 of my aunts and uncles that haven't been divorced. Like I'm a child of divorce. I am. Which like I like to remind my dad when like we were first splitting up, and he was just kind of like not flat out saying we don't do divorces, but he was just kind of like, "Oh, well, you know, you try to make." I'm like, "You do realize you're on wife number 2, right? We love her. We absolutely love her." But I was just like, "Sir, you know, because he there was one time he had said, "Well, you only get married once," and I was looking at him and I look at my stepmom and I'm like, "Really?" And then he realized what he said and he went, "Oh yeah." I'm like, "Yeah, we know you're with the person that like you were supposed to be with." You know, it's just I think there's like a little bit of shame that I still had with the fact that like I was gonna be divorced, and you know, I was trying to avoid that, and in doing that I lost myself. And in losing myself, I just started to like chip away at him, and that wasn't fair to either one of us. So when I finally left, I think there was like this huge like relief that it was just finally over.
I think that it's a lot of pressure, because I think the big thing with marriage, right? It's more just like it has this hierarchy of just like this is where you have to go, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a big thing. It's what is commitment,
Yeah. I
right? What's the difference between being committed and signing a piece of paper or being committed with somebody that's been, with for 10 years? There's no difference.
I think a
You
lot of
know,
people say that like marriage changes everything, and I was like, it can't. But then you get married and it's like you almost hit that finish line and you're like, okay, well, what are we working towards next? And it's like, no, you almost have to like this is shit that I've learned, but you almost have to restart the clock. Like go on your date nights, make sure that you're taking time to like throw your phone in a corner and like reconnect and stuff like that. And that's stuff that we didn't do. We hit the marriage stage and then we hit the roommate stage at like record speed because it was like, okay, what's next? It's like, okay, now we just live together for like literally ever. And we didn't take time
so
to work on each other.
I think that's a big thing. A typical thing you hear is, turning pain to power, right?
Mhm.
You probably heard that for, for a lot of different things. Tend to view things differently. Someone asked me, why did you use turning pain to purpose instead of turning pain to power? For me, what is power without purpose?
Mhm.
Think about it. If
Exactly.
you tend to, you go to the gym, you want to be the biggest person in the gym. Okay, when you become the biggest person in the gym, then what? There's no purpose behind it. I think that's a big thing with marriage and commitment. It's the same thing, but there's more pressure on marriage because that's a finish line.
Yeah, exactly.
We're just getting started. That's
Literally,
just getting
like
started.
we just restarted the damn clock. Like, great, I have your last name. Now what? You know, and I think that's
Exactly.
where a lot of the disconnect was. Like we both got very comfortable and then it's just there was a whole lot of things that were like behind the scenes, and it just turned into a complete shit show. And again, I still adore the absolute living hell out of him. He's a great person. He's a great uncle. He's a great friend. We did not mesh together well as partners. And I think when you realize, and the other end of like wanting to make my marriage work is there wasn't like a like legitimate reason, because all of society's got to have 850 opinions on why you're not working out anymore. But like nobody cheated. Nobody was like, abusive. Like the man never even raised his voice at me once, even when I probably, not necessarily deserved it. But if he had raised his voice like once or twice, it would have been like, oh, you know what? I'm a little out of line. I get it. But like there was nothing. So just being like, yeah, he's a great guy, we're just not working out, is like apparently not a legitimate reason to file for divorce. I was like, I'm
Yeah.
not happy.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing is now it's, people tend to break up, right? Lose that relationship. It's not necessarily because someone cheated or
Mm-hmm.
someone acted bad. Maybe it wasn't a fit at the time, or maybe
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't a fit in general. And I think that's a big thing is to learn that. It's, yeah, maybe we weren't that great now because maybe I had a lack of understanding, or maybe they had a lack of understanding, or, there's very variables in that. Or maybe just we're better off as friends versus partners.
Absolutely. Like the
I
second
think
we were actual roommates, fine. We'd get in a little tiff here and there like every couple of weeks versus like every 2 hours.
yeah, I think that's a big thing. It's not everything that ends is bad.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big thing is people try to have that stigma. It's like, well, that's your ex. You should never talk to them ever again. Like, no, if it ended badly, I 100% agree.
A
Like,
thousand
yeah, they
percent.
cheat on you. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
whatever, forget them. But if it didn't, like, what's the problem?
Yeah. Like we're better as friends. And a lot of it was like we got along really well because he was gone all the time, because he was at different military schools, and because he's in the guard, he got spun up for some stuff. So he wasn't home a lot. And we got married right when he wasn't home a lot. And then he was home, and he was home full time. And that's really where it started to crumble, because I could kind of overlook little things when he was home briefly, because, it just was what it was. I was used to my routine, and, doing my stuff. And then, yeah, he would come home and it wouldn't exactly fit. And so, like, again, a lot of what you were saying in your book was like light bulbing it for me. But yeah, that was like the thing, is once we got married and he was home full time, that's when the cracks really started to show, because you couldn't see a lot of cracks when he was only home for a few weeks at a time and then gone for the next like month. So, it was just kind of like that thing where I was like, had we like lived together full time for about, 6 months to a year, it would have ended very differently, but we didn't. And, we're now dealing with those consequences, but it didn't end horribly. And for that, I am grateful.
I think that's a good thing is it didn't end horribly and you guys are able to still connect. But I think a big thing was which you mentioned, right? Speaking of the cracks, it's a big saying I use is what we do in good times matters, but what we do in bad times, or I totally messed up the saying I normally say. So what we do in good times has an impact. What we do in bad times has the most impact.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I I mentioned that it's how many times that you had your parents, your spouse, your sisters, loved ones tell them they love you or they're proud of you. You probably can't count how many times they said that, you know, but how many times did they yell at you or they said something mean about you or they said something that hurt your feelings? I guarantee you can count those times. Guarantee it.
Yes and no, because the way I grew up, the good times was more of the wait, what the hell kind of moments. But yeah, like 90% of like my mental health obviously stems from my childhood. But then it was like those moments where, they'd be like, I love you or I'm proud of you. And it was almost like the world stopped, because I was like, what do you mean? Because that was so breadcrumbed in my house. So it's like a little different, but yeah, at the end of the day, what you're saying is completely accurate. Like what's gonna be a core memory is gonna be more of the like shitty times, you know, than the, you know, fun family vacations we went on and stuff. Like I remember those, but they're like more of a blur. I remember the fights we got into on vacation. but I don't really remember much of the vacation.
Exactly. I think that's a big thing is, people tend to do, with relationships, right? It's people tend to gauge like, we're just in a bad time. And he yelled at me or he threw something at me because he didn't know any better because we're in an argument. Like, no, that's the true person who that person is.
Yeah.
Um, especially if you want to bridge that on drinking alcohol, right? People
Mhm.
tend to start to express themselves that,
The
alcohol,
filters go
courage.
away.
Exactly. That's the true person who that is
Mhm.
when they're in that state. It's the same thing in the bad times. I had a friend reach out to me recently and they're going through a difficult time and they said, this person basically was a Dr. Jekyll, Mr.
Mhm.
Hyde. I was like, that's the real person. Is if you don't see that now, it's in the hard times. That's when that true personality comes out.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a big thing is people need to understand that, you have to bridge those boundaries, but also understand who you're with. Especially with the militaries, we tend to bury things because it's easy. We're not tend to be weak. That's a
Mhm.
weak mentality. We're not strong if we show emotions, but all at the same time, that's who we are.
Yep. 1000%. So to just wrap this up, because we could go on for like another 2 hours. If someone wants to start seeking help, where, in your opinion, like, do they start?
With themselves is to honestly look in the mirror. And I think the big thing is change your perspective,
Mm.
right? So I always tell people, pain is a teacher. What is it teaching me? So it's all about changing your perspective. Take yourself out of the equation. Look at your situation. Look at the other person's situation. Look at the situation as a whole. What can you learn from it?
Exactly.
So if you want, for me, like I didn't seek a life coach or I didn't seek a therapist. I literally just wrote everything down. And I think that's a big thing that we need to do is write everything down entirely how it is, not just how you think it is, but how it actually is.
Yep.
You know, what's the situation? How are you feeling? What was said? What did they say? Why do you think you felt that way? And then actually read it and look at it. That's when you actually see things from a different perspective.
Well, and I think
You know,
also being honest with yourself and understanding that you also contribute to the problem. There, and I'm not talking about like heavily abusive situations or anything like that. I'm talking about like, you know, there are certain situations where you're like, I think I may have sparked that fire. Like I didn't make it go into a forest fire, but I definitely sparked it.
exactly. I think the big thing it's humbling when you address the fact that you were part of the problem.
It's hard.
It's it's the thing is let's say you go to a very toxic relationship, like, well, he didn't mean to say that, or she didn't mean to say that, or they didn't mean to do this or do that, whatever the case is, but you're still there,
Mhm.
part of the problem. And it's doesn't sound good, but the reality is true. You stuck around because yeah, you maybe saw things that are more than you saw a vision that was more what you wanted, but it's not reality.
I
And that's
think
the humbling part.
yeah, I think the best advice my mom gave me that she got from her therapist was date the person, not the potential. And that is why I'm single as hell because I'm looking at these guys with all the potential, but I'm looking at who they are right now and I'm like, no. you
So
know?
I think that's so when it comes to dating, right? Like
Mhm.
I'm a dating guy myself. When it comes to that, it's just you have to also notice that who the person is for themselves, being
Mhm.
authentic, right? I think that's a big thing is you can always imposter a family event, but eventually when you live together, that's when you see the true colors. You
Yep.
know, authenticity matters. I think that's a big thing is we have to be authentic to ourselves and also
Mhm.
know when someone's authentic to themselves. When you see that, the sky's limitless once you get to that. Uh,
Yeah.
that's the big part is, with social media nowadays, we tend to show the good, but they don't show the bad. Let me see the bad stuff.
Yeah.
Let me see that.
Yeah, I want to see what's in like your Instagram saved because that's who you really are versus like the cutesy little highlight reel. But I mean, the potential versus the person is the same for like family, friends, like coworkers. Like you have to just meet people where they're at, and if that's not aligning with you, it's okay. It doesn't make you a bad person, and it's something that I'm still learning.
Well,
But
that's the big
we're getting there.
exactly. I think the big is setting boundaries, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the biggest thing we can do to help ourselves is set those boundaries, not necessarily for ourselves, but also for family. Like, yeah, they're family, everybody goes in that mentality where it's like family's over everything.
Mm-hmm.
I've learned the hard way that, family can do the most damage.
Yeah,
So setting those boundaries, like what aligns for where I'm trying to go or who I'm trying to be, and set it. Doesn't matter who's for, family, yourself, doesn't matter. As long as it's for yourself, that's what matters.
exactly. Well, Juan, thank you so much for hopping on Hot Mess Espresso. You can you can get his book on Amazon. It's called Turning Pain into Purpose, correct?
It's unbroken, turning pain to purpose, my
Yes.
story.
I was like, damn it, I missed a word. I forgot to bring it in from my from my library. But yeah, you can pick that up on Amazon. Obviously follow him on Instagram and all of that fun stuff. But yeah, thank you so much for hopping on. This has been phenomenal.
Thank you so much for having me.